And welcome to this webinar. It's obviously a busy time for everybody at the moment with the beginning of the academic year, but thank you for sparing the time to come along. So this is a webinar from the EAT-Erasmus Project, which is a project, not a function. We're not eating Erasmus. But this is going to be by Professor Prof Evans, introducing you to the EAT framework and the self-regulatory approach to assessment that she's developed as part of that. My name's Steve Rutherford. I'm a lecturer at Cardiff University, where Carol is also an honorary visiting professor as well. And I'm the project lead for the EAT-Erasmus Project. And it's a collaborative project between a number of different universities across Europe. So what we're going to do today, so do please feel free to turn your cameras on. That'd be great to see people's faces. If you could mute yourself so we don't hear people with their phones going in the background and things. And do please make comments in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat and answering questions as we go along. And if you've got a question, either pop it in the chat or stick your hand up electronically and we'll be able to get to you. So I'm just going to introduce you for 10 minutes or so to the EAT-Erasmus project. And then Carol's going to talk for a while about the EAT framework and how you can implement EAT and how you can embed it within your practice. Then we're going to have sorry, I've got the timings wrong there. We're going to have about half an hour discussion within groups, and then after that about quarter of an hour, half an hour of general discussion as a whole. So those are tentative timings. I've just realized I've got the timings wrong there. And then we'll wrap up at the end. The session is being recorded. I hope that's okay with people. And I'll share the recording with you afterwards once I've edited out the beginning bits, and we won't be recording the group discussions out in the breakout rooms. We've got a little Padlet that you could, we'd be very interested in your points of view as we're going along. That's a QR code, so you can just hold your phone up and scan that if you want to be taken to it, or I've just popped the link to that in the chat. And what we're asking you to contribute to that as we're going along is what facilitators and barriers you feel there are to effective assessment and effective feedback practices, either within your personal experience and your personal practice within your school or within your discipline or within your courses or modules or teaching, but also institutionally or maybe nationally. What do you think are the key drivers and barriers to assessment? And also there's a column there for if you've got anything you'd like more support on or more resources on, or think we should as a project focus on, do please add some ideas there, and we can use that to help develop resources as a whole. What all you need to do is go to that address, and under each of the headings, just click the little plus button if you've never used Padlet before, and you should be able to just type in a comment there, just a brief comment, and then we can share those outputs with people afterwards as well. So I just wanted to introduce you to the EAT project as a whole. As I said, I'm Steve Rutherford. I'm a member of the School of Biosciences and the Learning and Teaching Academy, it's now called, at Cardiff University. And the EAT-Erasmus Project is an Erasmus Plus project that was funded at the beginning of, well, in September 2020 was when we began. So we're a year into the project now. And the idea of the project was to develop resources for use by the community across Europe and across the globe related to effective and student-involved assessment. There are 6 partners in the group. So I'm managing the project, but it's really Prof Evans's brainchild, and the project. We're at Cardiff. Then there's EuroGeo, which is a collection of academics involved in geography, It's based in Belgium, and Carl Donat is the lead for that. There's the University of Zaragoza in Spain, and Rafael de Miguel Gonzalez is leading that one. There's Illyria College in Kosovo. Arbeirechi is the lead for that. Minho University in Portugal, and Manuel João Costa is leading it for Portugal. And Bristol University in the UK, and Sheila Amici-Dargan, who I think is maybe on this call today, hopefully, is leading it for Bristol in the UK. But the idea of the project is to develop resources that help across Europe, and we're developing as a European project and resource. The basis of this project and the idea behind it and the EAT framework in general comes from this little quote, I think, really from Carol herself in her publications, which is, how do we get students to co-own their programs and see themselves as active partners in that? And importantly, not seeing assessment as something that's done to them, but something they're involved in. It's part of their education, it's part of their learning, it's part of their overall educational experience. So the aims of the project really are to develop a suite of resources and support activities that we can share with academic staff and students that encourage a student-centered approach to assessment, an approach where we think about what the student is experiencing, think about how the student's developing, how the student's engaging with assessment as part of a learning activity. The project itself is aiming to develop a whole load of different resources, different mechanisms, different frameworks that we can use to help our colleagues understand effective assessment and implement it within their institutions. And what we want to do is gain a range of different experiences of people's assessment approaches across Europe in lots of different countries, different educational institutions, different cultures as well. And it's really encouraging to see there's several of my colleagues from European University Association project on assessment and curriculum that are also on this call, and I'll try and sort of post some links to that, and the outputs of that will come out next year. There are four major outputs for the project as a whole. The first one is developing some self-regulation resources that helps us as educators and also students identify ways we can encourage students to be more self-active, self-regulated in their assessment and their learning, and so find ways of encouraging them to be able to critique their own work and to become independent learners. The second output is developing some case studies by getting people to pilot the EAT framework in either a very small or large context within their schools and within their institutions, and to develop a training program that we can then share with people as a bespoke approach, or as a set of things that they can use to develop assessment within their institution. The third major output is developing a range of training resources and communications, and this webinar is one of those resources. And we're developing a large, massive open online course that hopefully will go live in late 2020 or early 2023, that can support people, 2022, sorry, or early 2023, that can support people in developing their ideas around assessment and embedding good assessment practices. And then finally, output 4 is about developing some relatively agreed standards for assessment and some professional recognition approaches that people can use. Two major ones of those that we'd be interested in getting people involved in, if you'd like that, would be firstly with the outputs about self-regulation. We've developed some of those, and the document I shared with you has come out of that development process. And what we'd like to do is, if anyone's interested, involve you in reviewing and piloting those resources to see whether they're useful, to see whether the language is okay, to see whether they're accessible to students, and so on. The other one we'd like to try and involve people in as much as possible is in piloting the EAT framework within your own institution. And that can be at a very small level or a massive level. So at the end of this session, I'll send out a little survey just to ask what your feedback on the session was, but also if in case you'd be interested in learning more about EAT, staying in touch with the project, or piloting EAT within your institution or within your own teaching. And there's an opportunity for you to leave information there, and I can contact you, or a member of the team can contact you to discuss how we can help you take it forward. And that could be at the module or course level within your own teaching or a single assessment, or it could be across a whole degree program or a course of study. It could be across a whole year group of students. It could be within a school or a department or a faculty. And we'd like to get a range of different experiences from different types of disciplines: humanities, science, clinical, performance arts, languages, but also different ways people have of teaching and assessing. So different types of assessments, and whether you can use this framework to help improve and enhance those. Oh, okay, so that's me introducing the project. What I'll do now is I'll stop sharing and I'll hand over to Carol. And Carol's going to do an introduction to EAT as a whole, and how you can implement EAT. And then we'll have some discussions about what the particular challenges are within your own local environments, and how you can maybe implement EAT or use EAT to help push that forward. So Carol, over to you.
Okay, I'm just trying to see if it'll upload. Yep, right. Are we on this? So
yeah, that's great.
We're okay. Thank you, first of all, everybody. So the way we're going to work it is I will take you through. I looked at those that are participating today, know some very familiar faces who've contributed massively. So thank you. And also some new faces. So it gave me a quandary in terms of the irony of talking about self-regulation, but also how do we do this with each other? So my thoughts, you can't take the teacher out of me. I was a head teacher in a previous life. So I always think, where can I get information on this from? Where has it come from? What can I get from it? How can I use it? So I'm going to try and cover some of those aspects, but also look at it in terms of thinking about transitions. Now, Steve very kindly sent you a small pack of information plus a particular version of the framework. And in that, we put some selected resources in there, not everything, but I will mention some of those resources today and why they're relevant and where else you can go to get things. So I'll give you a quick overview, and then I want to allow enough time for any questions. If you want to post questions in the chat function as we go along, we'll try and respond to those. And if we don't respond to all of them, then we'll try and follow up with you on that later. Do use the Padlet, because I'm really interested. We're all very interested in from your perspective about the facilitators and barriers. So I'm just going to move forward and say, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where it came from, the use of it. I'll talk about impacting the discussion more around things and the evidence base that we have. And I'll just want to share some key learning points that we found from doing this work. The last project I was involved, we had about, I think, 500 direct staff involved and 3,000 students directly involved. But we're actually looking at first-year undergraduates and we were looking at the patterns for first-year undergraduates over 3 successive years, not the same group following through to degree, but first years coming in across different universities. And it was absolutely fascinating what we learned from that. And I never cease to learn from all of these things. And the teams that have been doing this work have been highly successful. So we kind of coined the term political literacy, but it gave people skills to navigate systems beyond which they thought. And also it empowered a lot of our students to go on and do amazing things. So the best kick I get out of it is when people are empowered to do things for themselves. So what is it? If I was describing it simply, what is EAT? It's a model. It's a model, conceptual and theoretical, that tries to get people to think about how all the different bits of assessment are joined together, and therefore an obsession with one aspect of assessment can be limiting in terms of, often people tell me they have a particular problem with assessment, but usually the problem isn't what we initially first think it is. It stems back from something else. I'm not the first person to talk about integrated assessment. I won't be the last. And people come from it from different perspectives. And I come from it from a particular lens, which I'll just tell you a little bit about. So this statement features at the beginning of the framework, how students come to co-own their programs. I remember going to Hong Kong and seeing students actually marketing their courses and being very disappointed when other students didn't enroll on them. And I remember standing there saying, this is amazing. Or students working with staff when they recognized there was a regulation problem, saying, we've got a problem, not you've got a problem, and I'm going to litigate. It's our problem. We share that. There's a big problem with this. And some of you might be picking up in Padlet at the moment. Do students want to do that? Often not. They want to be given, because many in the English school sector, I'm not talking about other school sectors, I won't generalize, and even in the English school sector it varies, but and I can talk with experience of many years of hard labor out there, is that we're brilliant at teaching students how to go through the system and to do well. I think teachers are phenomenal, but to what extent is that over-regulating students? I remember Dylan William talking about the fact that the whole point of formative assessment was to support students to take control. But in actual fact, the target-driven nature of it in schools meant it was anything but what it was originally conceived to be. The other point is, how do academics, and I use the term broadly, figure what the role of students is? And again, what is their view on partnership? And it's a big stumbling block in terms of what people feel students should or should not be involved in. Which is a fundamental thing to start off with. If I take you through the origins, I'm not going to spend long on this, but I'm just going to give you the breadcrumbs, the breadcrumb trace. So it started off with work I was doing at the Institute of Education back in 2011 as part of an NTF project where they gave amazing funding for projects on that. But it comes from work that I did that was published in Review of Educational Research on making sense of assessment feedback. And for that, I was analysing over 4,000 pieces of work and trying to say, what are the features of effective assessment feedback practice? And generally speaking, they're known. They are really clearly known. But for me, the issue was the translation of those into pragmatic stuff. So how do I take all that research and then how do I use it in practice? And for me, there was a barrier there. So the framework came from me dissecting the literature and putting it into the model that became EAT, the wheel, the web, however people want to conceive it. So it was a conceptual thing about these are all the things that matter. And if I could press a button and spin it, because all those things are interrelated and I don't have the graphical skills, as I was saying to Steve, to actually show it properly, I would. But since its inception, it went through massive evolution from 2015 onwards in terms of talking to staff from every single discipline. And the language of it changed, the shape of it changed, the constructs changed as we tried to make it work for every single discipline. And then what I did was added other reviews into it. So it ended up with 11 constructs to start with, and then it became 12 because we discovered that in practice, understanding rules and regulations was a massive issue for staff and students. So that came into it. And then I tested it through lots of other literature reviews. So for example, I then looked at individual differences in learning, which is my baby, the area that why people perceive information differently to each other. I think it's absolutely fundamental. It's how we work. And then I did further reviews on high impact pedagogy, student engagement, learning gain, and kept updating the resource base for the EAT framework. So to date, there are 50,000 pieces of work that I've read and dissected. And I've also worked with it in practice over the last 10 years, 11 years. I can't find any more categories. So you want to test me on that, do. But I think I've saturated it. I can't find any more categories that I would put into that framework at all, as far as we've gone so far. Not to say there might not be some more in the future, but at the moment, I can't see anything else. So, okay, what can we use the tool for? It's a starting point to say, where are our strengths? Do we allow students in to assessment or not? Do students want to come in? On what areas could we start to think about our practice? The joy of it is you can use it at a tiny level to look at something on your own, irrespective of everybody else. So that everybody else can go and do their thing, but you can look at it on your own. It has massive, obviously, benefits, though, as looking at it as a team. And institutionally, it can be really powerful, as we found at Southampton University, where we had a very strong team of what we called Research Assessment Practices team, the RAP team, that went on to amazing success from professional services staff, academic and teaching focused staff. It does unearth the beliefs and values. And if I was talking to all of you, I think you probably would smile or scream at all the microcultures that exist in higher education and all of the unknown rules. If you've navigated lots of different environments in your career, how where you thought you knew it all and you move into another environment and you know nothing, and they all seem to do it in a different way. Fascinating. Now, it was devised as, I called it, a semiotic. It's a sign, it's a symbol. It's not as simple as the Nike swoosh. I wish it was. But it represents the interconnected nature of assessment. But there was something very weird that we found. Well, not weird, but I find these things sexy. We were finding that students' engagement with aspects of EAT impacted how well they did. And we're like curious. We're like, but this is not a psychometric tool. It never set out to be. It was never intended to be. But because we started finding relationships, not in every place, but I'm talking at the module level, and I'll talk about that later, because that's at the level that we're going to be seeing these changes. They get kind of mutated or lost when we aggregate information. So we could see the impact that it was having. So we looked at the factor structure of the framework, and it actually loads very nicely on two factors. And they're not surprising factors. One is the degree of engagement of student in willing to step up and own it. And the other one is their ability to understand the system they're in, to navigate it, and to understand what they need to do. And some people broadly would call that assessment literacy. But those are the two fundamental things that underpin it. However, we wanted to go on and develop, and again, we'll talk to you about this, we wanted to develop the predictive validity further by actually breaking it down further and actually doing a proper psychometric tool. So we'll talk about that. We also notice patterns of change. Again, we make assumptions about first in family, commuter students, BAME students, low sex students. And could you predict their patterns of how they navigate a module? And it's fascinating. How students engage is highly variable, and there are group patterns. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference on the final result, and sometimes it does. And it's really fascinating, but it blows certain assumptions out of the water. In our project at Southampton, and I think my colleague Xiao Tung is in the space, so she may be able to answer questions on this as well if I put her on the spot. But we also found in some of our projects that it was BAME students that engaged more, not less. So the ways that we were developing the self-regulation work was actually, and we did not have any BAME gaps in the projects that we were looking at Southampton, the focus case studies. I'm not saying there weren't BAME gaps at the institutional level. We also looked at, if you were trying to work things through at the institutional level, what would be the stepping stones that you would need to take? And that came out of the Office for Students work. We did on reducing differential learning outcomes. The article is there and the link if you want to use it. Steve mentioned he's also involved in another EUA project around assessment and learning and technologies. There is a website, it's embryonic. I haven't added the Erasmus stuff yet, but you can, if you go into the framework. I'm looking like a Blue Peter thing, you can't even see it, can you? Sorry. But if you go into the framework button, the different versions of the framework are there, except for the latest version, which has got to go on. But if I took you through a trawl, there are numerous versions of this framework. The joy of it, it's under a Creative Commons license, so you can adapt it. You can adapt the content, and what's happened as we work with different people, it gets adapted. But we have the kind of crumb trace back to the original version at Southampton. If you do right click on the links, it will take you to them. I also sent you it in that little pamphlet that we gave you. There is one version that I did at Birmingham that is alternative ways of displaying the diagram, and it's more glossy, it's more showy, if you want me to speak. The same version, but more my basic version without all the frills. And the original the diagrams are in the 220, what I call full version. We've got an Australian abridged version, which looked at the standards framework in Australia. And also we've now got a shortened Erasmus version, which the language has changed and evolved to make it more accessible to certain European partners, in terms of some things don't translate across certain areas. So quite conscious of that. But you actually, that version, the Erasmus EAT version, I've left the diagrams as Word docs so that you can change the words really easily, but you have some formatting issues. But you can get it to focus on what you want. So it allows you to evolve and develop it for your context, whether it be biological sciences, whether it be graphic art, whatever it is, you can adapt it. So that's an important point. The other thing, if I go back to the starting points, now just take you through some of the concepts. So I've just told you where to find the information, so I hope that's okay. And if you do have further questions, do come back to us. I started off with this in the first version in 2016 to say assessment has to keep up with what the discipline requires. We talk a lot about 21st century skill sets. We're talking today about self-regulation, and there is so much out there that talks about the relationship between self-regulation and attainment. However, we talk about deep approaches, and that's one thing I want to ask you about. What does that mean? Isn't necessarily related to success, because if the assessment doesn't require you to demonstrate it, a highly self-regulating student won't go there necessarily. So if students clearly see that certain skill sets are not required for the end result, that's going to really kind of undo what you're trying to achieve. So if we don't value those really high level skills, we can't expect students to step up to use them. And to what extent, there's big debate about academic standards at the moment. Are they stretching students sufficiently? Are they at the right level? If we've had to change things, have we also changed our expectations of what skills we want students to be able to master and how? So coming into this, in the pack I gave you, just to give you some background, I've also put some other appendixes. So Appendix A is absolutely fundamental if you have time to go and look at that. That was fascinating. That came from the first article I wrote for Review of Educational Research, which was based on that synthesis. And I came out with what these principles of effective assessment were, but the students at Southampton University said they were gobbledygook, as they probably were for them. So they rewrote them, and then they took them to our representative body at the university to have them put into policy. And those, I've used those across different contexts. The language of them slightly changes, but by and large, those things are things that actually really do matter. And the ones in bold, especially around understanding criteria and process, are really important to students. It's quite interesting. We interviewed students at the end of their first year across different universities. And thank you to Surrey and Kingston colleagues if you're in this meeting, because we also work very closely and very grateful for the work that you did. We found that a lot of students at the end of first year had no idea what standards they were supposed to be working towards. And some of them had never even seen what criteria meant or were. at all, but had actually done okay, but could they have done a lot better? And obviously some had actually completely bombed it. So understanding what matters and our staff all in agreement around those effective assessment principles is a really good starting point. We also found that stumbling block between this extent to which we let students in. And sometimes things need to be very directive, and that is the best mode. Lectures are not evil. Lectures are brilliant. Most of us learn fantastically through lectures. It depends what type of knowledge we're trying to acquire. They have their place. So it's how do we engage students appropriately in the particular knowledge and skills that we're trying to develop? So we looked at that. I also included there a supporting transitions one-pager that I was using in Australia with students as we were going through COVID. How do we get them into the environment and make it agentic for them? So what can we do? In developing the resource that's in the pack that we sent you, we also looked at what are those high-level skills that make a difference? And they come from these ones, but they're dissected down to a lower level. About, do students choose the right strategy to use, and do they use them well? Do they actually assess the requirements of the task correctly? Often not. So your problem is way early. So a lot of people obsess about students not using feedback, but in actual fact, a lot of the problems are in understanding the task and implementing the task and goals. So one of the biggest things that factors how a student does is grade goal. And grade goal is what's the minimum level they're happy with. And it might be different to our conceptions of that, but asking students what they're aiming for, really powerful agenda item. And the quality of that goal setting is absolutely fundamental to student success. One thing that we were very interested in the EAT framework was about how students use an environment, that contextual regulation. I used to work with with supporting doctors who were failing, very bright individuals. They'd go to one rotation, do brilliantly. They'd go to another specialism and they'd fail. And what was it about them and the environment that they were reading the cues wrongly? And a lot of arguments would be people use a lot of cues. When I say cues, things that give you a clue about how well you're doing, and those can be internal clues that you're using, but we often use the wrong cues a lot rather than the better cues to guide us. And a lot of this work was, we talked about how we monitor our progress towards our goals. But if our goals are poor in the first part, I use that phrase from my geographical past: garbage in, garbage out. Stay with me for life. We can spend hours analysing garbage. So it's that quality of what we're doing in the first place. And one of the biggest issues in self-regulation is that ability to be able to judge the quality of things. And that's the ultimate goal. And how do we support students to do that? And in answer, if I was getting to the end of this, I would just tell you, if you're one that wants to go straight to the end, then you need to embed it throughout. You have to give students lots of opportunities to test their understanding from the get-go and throughout the whole programme that you're working with. If I go back to it, just tell you a little bit about it. Principles it's underpinned by are equity, agency, and transparency. So it's all about how do we provide autonomy promoting environments for individuals. And I would like you to think about your own experiences, how you go into some environments and you can fly, you can thrive, and you walk into another and you're constrained from the get-go, or you've perceived that you are, but you might feel constrained, but another person might not be. But there are some general principles out there in terms of what do we do to enable people to fly. I am a pragmatist, I assure you, but I do believe we can go there. I have a real problem with people being held back on things because we should be enabling all people to get to where they want to get to. We shouldn't be holding them down. But sometimes systems do, as we all know, especially in higher education. The model, I'm not going to go through it now, it's in all the detailed guides, talks about all these different things that are really important in assessment and feedback in terms of developing student self-regulatory skills. And I've mentioned how everything is joined together, and it's really important to see it as such, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The student-staff partnership one, people talk about it. It's practically in all policies I read at different universities, but how it's enacted is usually quite far from the reality. And many of you who are in this session, you are in that space and you advocate strongly in that space. So I'm talking to the converted, I believe, because you wouldn't be here if you weren't. But it is an issue. It is an issue around that. And as I said, for me, it's about being research informed. I have a real problem with ill-informed approaches to things, because if you're asking people to give up their time, you're not valuing their time if you're asking them to do something where there isn't a strong evidence base behind it. And I feel very strongly about that. And we have a responsibility to look after each other, and doing things where there are very little evidence of it being effective are problematic. And I'll mention some of those in a second. And again, some of these might be controversial because there will always be an example which breaks the rule, but we need to, where's our evidence base to support that? So it's a tricky one because the context is everything here. As I said, three kind of things massively important. Agentic engagement is a really important concept underpinning this framework, which is about how an individual manages to use the environment to support their own learning. And those who prosper well know how to utilize the environment. They know how to adapt the environment, even if the affordances in it are limited. They know how to do that. As I said, self-regulation is about understanding one's own learning, and I'm not going to go into all the different metacognitive, cognitive, and affective processes today. They will be in that report that we're writing. And I also mentioned assessment literacy, so I'm not going to spend more time on that now. If I go to the person that probably I respect most in the area of assessment, it would be Roy Sadler's work, because it just makes such great sense. And there are loads of great authors and researchers in this space, and all of us will have our penchant, and it's all equally valid. But I really do think Royce gets frustrated by the emphasis. He would like us to be focusing on how supporting students to do things in the moment. He gets very frustrated with this overemphasis on reflection and looking back, because it's giving students the opportunities to demonstrate that they can do, to apply, to adapt. So how do they get that knowledge that's internal to themselves? Here is the EAT framework, boom, and gets interesting reactions. I'm not going to go through those different components. I've got 3 dimensions: literacy, feedback, and design. They're all intertwined, as I've said. Those 12 areas, as I said, are me saturating the literature. They're the things that really make a difference. But they are all intertwined. If I just pick out one example, I could say, if I have no idea what a good standard of work is, which is the one that's at the top on the right, AL1, then how can I evaluate the quality of my work? I can't do it because I don't have any understanding of quality. Often you can use one of these things to go in. So I can say, okay, let's look at making the assessment criteria clear. And that seems very straightforward. You can get very quick wins on that. But there are a couple of things there. Often through doing that, you unearth the fact that the learning outcomes are not appropriate, which takes you into design, which is AD2. Or you actually discover that telling doesn't work. So unless students have helped to develop those criteria and actually understand what they mean, it's very difficult. And we all have problems with generic criteria ourselves. What is the difference between good or very good? What is the difference between synthesizes well to synthesizes excellently? And we use really difficult or simple terms. What does that mean in practice? So it's that exemplars. As I said, we can provide training on how to use this in lots of different ways and at different levels. So I could take the whole framework and just change it to look at transition activities that you need to focus on in each of those 12 areas if I wanted to. Okay. I'm not going to read this slide. It's just an interesting one about looking at that connectivity bit around, again, that obsession around feedback that I often get from people. 60% of them never downloaded it from the electronic management system. Vast waste of resource as a manager. But is the feedback in the right place? First of all. 2, is it an end task where the feedback doesn't relate to anything moving forward? Therefore, students sees the redundancy of it. And so, as I was saying, my argument around the feedback one is, do students actually understand it and how are they using it moving forward? I don't want students to spend copious hours reflecting on feedback that has no relevance in moving their journey forward, or doesn't tell me whether they have taken the right messages and know how to apply them. So we can get stuck in that obsession with reflection, but reflection with no knowledge is limited, and reflection with nowhere to take that learning is also limited. And I'm being quite extreme about that because I think there's a lot of resource that we can use better. As I said, we can scale it. We can. So on this, it's 1 means I'm kind of in the room, but not there, And 5 means I'm all over it like a rash. And we ask students at the beginning of programs to say, where are you on this continuum? And to what extent do you get engaged in things? The area that students are less sure about is working with peers. There's a whole separate session on misuse of peer learning and really good peer learning and how that works. Schneider and Prekel, in their meta-analysis of things that made a difference to how students do, one of the biggest things was, one of them was peer learning, but not peer learning in itself. It's the fact that in assessing someone else, you get to calibrate where you are yourself. So it's by marking someone else's work, you get an understanding of things for yourself. But also what was very highly relevant is students having that critical capacity to be able to judge the quality of feedback they receive, because they get a lot of random feedback that is not useful. So especially from peers. So how do they learn to be judicious in that? So how do we set that up? As I said, I'm just going to mention a few things about transition. So self-regulation. Self-regulation has become one of those words like critical reflection that we banter it about, and it means a million different things. So it can be a process where we talk about identifying the requirements of the task, planning, goals, taking the task and reflecting on it. It's a continuous cyclical thing. It goes backwards and forwards. It can be looking at particular constructs. And I did do an analysis in a paper which was written with me and a colleague, and I'll give you the link to it in a minute, which actually said which are the constructs that may be comprising self-regulation actually have the biggest impact on outcomes. Self-efficacy, the belief in or academic self-efficacy, my belief in my ability to do well, my previous experience of doing well, are massively important in affecting how well people do. So people's perceptions. So do learning environments enable people to say, yes, I can do this and adopt learning goals? Or do learning environments switch people off, which means they self-regulate very well, but not in a learning way? They self-regulate to protect themselves. And we've probably all done that sometimes in our lives where we've avoided things because of damage to self and ego. And there are lots of ways that people protect themselves, their self, rather than engaging in something which they think might actually undo them. As I said, we could look at self-regulation in particular of completing a particular task, or a general approach to my ability to self-assess, which is much more general. And it can be individual or it can be shared. And in our report, we'll talk more about that. I talk a lot about how the affective dimension of learning is the glue that holds our cognitive and metacognitive thinking together. And I strongly believe that it's setting up those conditions to enable us to learn. If we get into the self-regulation information in detail, which I'm not going to do today, we talk a lot about working memory capacity. Any of you who know when you put the milk in the oven and when you cannot remember the words to say in a presentation, which will happen to me any second, you know you're overloaded. And if you're upset, it goes out the window. And online learning certainly increases the regulatory load on anybody, staff, student, animal, all of us. And as I said, one of the key things, as I've said, is do we spend enough time thinking about the task analysis side and the planning side of things? That's all I'm going to say here. And also, if I take another model by another great guru of the self-regulation world, Zimmerman, he was saying, how do you embed throughout the learning experience where students get to observe, see things? If we ask students to critically think or to do something in a certain way, if they've never seen it, how can I do it? I remember learning SPSS. Anybody of you done that? Statistical packages for social scientists? I learned it on my own, on a laptop. It was not intuitive for my little brain. And it took me hundreds of hours of doing that. If I had had something to have seen, something to, so I knew how to get there, I probably could have reduced that learning time considerably. But do students get the opportunity to see what it looks like as a good thing? Do they get an opportunity to repeat it with support? Do they get an opportunity to trial it out? In the education world, we talk about approximations of practice and less risky, but trialing things. And do we know whether they can actually apply things and translate them and they become internalized? So where are those opportunities throughout a curriculum? I read an article this morning which was saying actually one of the most effective things in online learning is self-quizzes. Students self-testing has a massive effect on outcomes. I haven't read the size of the sample, but it was a kind of a review of a number of papers recently undertaken, quite interesting one to look at. I'll find it for you. The article I mentioned where we did summarize all the variables that impact outcomes and which ones are most important is this one, which is another free resource. I believe in free resources. And you can get it there. I'm not going to go into it today, but there's a big diagram and it shows you all those different variables that come in. And I'm just going to briefly, before I finish, if I'll just go for a few more minutes just to talk you through some of the things that we're picking up. So what I find sexy about this is, I find a lot of things sexy, is the fact that if you can support students to develop the strategy skill sets, you can override the individual differences and the lack of cultural capital that students may come into university with. That to me, in access and participation plans, is gold dust. And you can be very powerful in that space. We were able to prove at that module level you could do that by adopting this inclusive practice about how you bring students into an environment, how you make things very transparent. All of those kind of things make a massive difference. But I also, and again, I brought in a couple of things here because I wanted to bring you in some of the things that I find really useful. And so Friedlander's work, I always cite it because, again, I very much based in that information processing, neurobiology side of things about students being rational agents and having to triage limited resources and not attending to things that are not actually most important to them. And yet we know that, we've known that for donkey's years, forgive a technical term. But to what extent do we overload students at point of transition into universities? And how much of what you say to them at the beginning is remembered? Schneider and Prekel, another big meta-analysis, very powerful one in 2017, said that found, induction programs that were teaching students generic skills at point of entry into university had no impact on outcomes. It was those courses that were embedded within the discipline which made the difference. It's an interesting one to take on board, but there will be exceptions to the rule, as I've said. But I think it's quite interesting to follow the evidence. We asked you about this, about the barriers and affordances, and hopefully, and again, there's a very good article in Medicine by Van der Sweat about developmental space, about what are all those things that enable us to achieve and limit us within a particular environment. And sometimes the whole design of assessment can be problematic. We've learned during COVID, and we've all felt the pain, but actually policy can be agile. The issue there then is communication. And policy always should have been agile because we should be evolving it in requirements to needs of our students. But you also need the overview because incremental change can be catastrophic to the overall coherence of something. So there's quite a damage. Oh, it's only a little change. But you add up all those little changes and they're like a concrete cancer eking away at the whole structure of something. And that's me being a bit dramatic, so I apologise for that. And as I said, if I was looking at transitions, how do I bring students in to understand what good looks like, how assessment fits together? But again, we did find, if I'm thinking of a holistic learner, students need to see the whole view. Many of us look to the end of something before we start it. We need to know where we're going. We found very few students when they started wanted to know about the whole picture. But actually, it is very important. The students who were doing the best were the ones that were thinking about the whole picture, because they were thinking about where to invest and where not to invest, what was connected with the next thing, which is part of that thinking deep. And we come into conflict here because there are lots of different things we can do. So where should we focus our time? So I've just given you some of the projects that we have found that have been really successful. We had a history project which was looking at gaps in the history curriculum in schools, and then looking at history, the history course at the university, and saying, okay, these are the gaps. How do we focus on those in that first year? How do we redesign assessment to really focus on the acquisition of these fundamental building blocks that are not there? Highly relevant at the moment. The other ways that I wanted to direct attention to in terms of some of the resources we're developing at the moment would be, to what extent do we signal the core and threshold concepts, the ones that you need in order to move on? I've been behind lots of groups of students who have said things like, well, I didn't know it at school. Why do they expect me to know it here? I don't think I need to know it. Understanding I've put rate limiting steps. What's the thing that means I can't undo the jar or the bottle of wine? Is it my strength in my hand? What is it? Why can't I do that? I talk about removing unnecessary noise, which is what's in the module that doesn't need to be there? What's the core thing that you really need to be teaching? And where's all the other stuff that you've accreted onto it that just you could strip off? It doesn't need to be there. You can make them aware of it, but you don't need to be teaching it. And I've put there about ensuring students have multiple opportunities to check and multiple opportunities to mark and moderate work from the get-go, just as we would ask academics. I want to stop now in a couple of minutes to allow discussion. So one of the things we asked you to look at was in terms of, if you had to model what a deep approach was in your discipline, what would it look like? And this is something I would like really, if any of you are interested in following up on this short task skills case study we asked you to do. What is it to be deep within your particular subject or in a particular skill that you're trying to get students to acquire? I'm really fascinated about that. There's a very useful article there on that. And those are the questions we raised with you that we'd really like to tackle. I looked at it in terms of medical education and teacher education, in terms of students being willing to put their ideas out there, being able to own the material so that they could translate it in lots of different formats. And I had some of the things there around some of those effective practices. But what would it be in terms of a particular skill acquisition that you wanted students to master? So if I was teaching fieldwork, what would be a key skill that I would need them to master? And how could I permeate that through the curriculum of that module so they develop those skills to a very high level? How would I do that? What particular skill could we focus on or make clear to students? I'm going to stop there and unshare so that we can have a conversation. I'm sorry I went on a bit longer than I had intended, but as I said, we've got this resource coming out Christmas as our present, and we would like to get feedback on it. We'd like some examples of people delving into what things, specific skills development or blueprints where you signpost or show people examples of how you've signposted key concepts. Do lecturers on the same module agree? Quite a lot of our colleagues have found that's not necessarily the case. And then we have a new survey tool for staff and one for students. If people want to use it, you're very welcome to use it, but you might need to get ethical consent to do so, and help develop that new model. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and we're going to come in and ask people to come in and ask questions, but you will need to unmute yourselves. And we can also look at any questions that people have raised. I've unmuted. Have I unshared now?
Yeah.
Nice one.
Thanks, Carol. I'll just share one thing that Eileen O'Leary had put in the comments. I'd like to know more about the motivation to stay attending and to build the trust and to stay involved when other things are happening in students' lives. I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that, Eileen, but I think that's a very interesting question.
Listen, thank you. And I suppose I was more delighted to hear all of what I was hearing, actually, Carol. And, you know, like I think you said it yourself there, you were preaching a little bit here to the converted. And if we could just carry everyone along, it would be fantastic.
I know.
But I suppose what I do find is, you know, with the best intention and the best setting up and the best involvement as much as you can do in a particular module, because you're trying to give that same energy to every module, I can often find that when you don't know what's going on with students, and in particular now because we're so much online, you don't even get to see the faces a lot of the time. You know, is there has anything come through in how to motivate them to, you know, stay with it, stick with it? What can we do to keep them motivated? It's more or less what I've written there, but I do love what I've heard. And I mean, I think you've done a fantastic job in pulling all the angles together, from the assessment literacy, from the assessment design, from the understanding of the students' perspectives, etc. I mean, I've had all these pieces individually before, but it's super how it's pulled together. So sorry for keeping talking now. I just wanted to say that.
I mean, going back to that, as you all know, belonging, and it comes into that idea, that disciplinary identity, which I put in AL4, which again permeates the whole thing. Student sense of belonging, there's lots of research out there that impacts whether students stay. And it's not necessarily related to whether they're good or not. It's whether they feel that they can identify. Now, one thing that you can do very early on, you can plot the networks that students use. And from that, we were able to predict how students would do. The quality of those networks, one of those things about a deep approach is that. Now, you talked about engagement. Again, it's really difficult. Classic one is you are a module lead. You teach brilliantly. Suddenly, week 9, they're not there. Why not? They're doing an assessment for somebody else. So it's how does everything fit together? I used to get students to do Gantt charts, you know, like building a house chart. What am I doing each month? And I got them to personalize them and overlay their different modules and where the crunch points were. And we used to articulate those. But the other thing is, if you want, again, in an ideal world, they would all be engaged all the time. But I said they're discerning. And actually, Schneider and Preckle said the students that do best don't work hard all the time. They know where to employ their efforts and where not to. I've seen students do calculations about where they want to drop marks because they can afford to. So it's really fascinating on this. But for me, the way you get them in, even those that maybe have set very low grade goals that actually say, I'm just going to get by, you can convert those by, obviously, it's changing the modus operandi of actually the assessment. So I talk about authentic assessment, and I talk about, David Bowd talks about sustainable assessment, that, you know, students need to be able to understand it for themselves so they can carry it forward. I take that, but I also add on to it, assessment involves so much of my time, your time, everybody's time. It's got to have more currency. So if I can design at least an aspect of assessment within a module that has a benefit to the individual's life in terms of carry forward, they can see its career opportunities. If it has a benefit on a local community, so to what extent can that assessment be on something that you'd want to get out of bed to do, or that you cannot hide from? You know, the simple example is having to present how I arrived at X rather than chucking you in 2,000 words, which I don't have to think about. I can just fill up 2,000 words and blend it from lots of places. But again, more assessment on the process. How did you get to that thinking rather than just purely on the end product? But also, I mean, there's some really great stuff out in the sector about students giving legal advice. I know Claire Macaulay was, I haven't said her name right, she's now at Manchester, she was at Sheffield, started a lot of works on about students actually co-constructing the whole curriculum. They developed symbols. I'll never forget, she said they ended up with some symbols that represented some radical group, so that changed them. Fascinating stuff. But it's in, or, you know, business studies students giving business advice to people doing startups, all those kind of things. So how can you do it so people can't hide in the system? Or, as I said, in the online environment, how do you therefore, again, it's taking out the noise. What's the core things that you need to deliver, because they are absolutely so fundamental. I used to have certain concepts in geography that they were so complicated that everybody used to fall down on them. So that I knew that they were the fundamental things that I had to focus on. But then how do you build it so the students have to run the sessions? They have to start, a group has to start the session. They have to, and again, it goes back to, this is an interesting one, and I'll just stop, is about, I talked about entitlement and boundaries. So at that point of entry, where are the rules about what they're expected to do on your module? And how do you enforce those rules from the get-go? Now, what we found, try doing that 4 weeks in, lost, because they've got multiple other lives by then, and they ain't going to go for it. But it's actually reinforcing, you will be expected to do this. I remember a whole group of medical consultants turning up to do something with me, and they had all the excuses under the sun for obviously valid reasons of saving lives. And I said, sorry, not good enough. Can't run the session. You ain't done the work. Bye-bye. And I know that's difficult in a higher education environment, but there are ways that you can build it in where you get that momentum. But you do need to have the oversight about the whole program design, maybe actually
that's key.
Straight jacketing you as well. And that's a bigger decision about how do you prevent those things from happening. And that's how you design together to prevent those blockages. And so basically anticipating the mind of the student and how they might feel going through it.
Living in their shoes. Yeah, no, I love it. Thanks a million, Carol. Thanks a million.
Any other questions from the audience? We were going to do a sort of breakout room activity, but it's probably a bit late to do that. But
any questions, and however profound or difficult, please just share. Or any things that are coming in the comments.
Claire's shared something in the comments of setting rules of engagement, doing that in week 1, semester 1. Students construct rules of engagement for each other and for tutors. Do you want to speak to that a bit more, Claire?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'd love to. I don't know if you can hear me okay. I'm trying out.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, something I've started working on because I've become so obsessed with kind of expectation management, I suppose, that I did this with my first years last week. What do they expect from each other, and what do they want from us? And of course, you start off with, we'd like you to be supportive and give us information. And I said, look, you need to give me something to work with here. What does that mean? What do you want me to put on my to-do list? And actually what we end up with is fantastic. It's, we'd like a 5-minute podcast, summarizing the key learning points this week. Very easy stuff to do. They're really kind of quick wins. But I think we haven't quite got as far as I'd like to in terms of students as partners, but it really helps them to feel like they kind of own the thing. Something else that we do, but I didn't put it in the chat, is that I work in the business school at Brookes, and well, let's look at some live companies, but give me a long list and I'll turn it into a short list of 5 or 6, and then you can choose one. So we've got enough structure that I can give them some support, but they've still got choice. And easy things like that, takes a tiny bit more time at the start, but makes such a difference.
And linked to that is also that it's also around somebody. I remember talking to an engineering school, and I said, you need to be. I find a lot of module guides say, well, you can have around this amount of support, or and it's so faffy. And I remember I used to deal a lot with complaints, and I said to one master's student, do you realise you had 36 hours of support? You're entitled to 12. And he said, well, I'd have seen it and I said, I'm more worried because that time was well wasted if it had no impact on your learning. But it's, where are those boundaries? And again, I want people to start looking at, well, people do, you all do in this meeting because you're here, but that feedback isn't something you give to somebody. It's all the different sources of information that students can strive on to find out for themselves. But it is about, we know, for example, one of the most effective things I did in an earlier project was we shortened all the talk sessions by 15 minutes. And then we asked students to raise the key things that they didn't understand. And then other students would then bring sources of ways that they tackled that to the next session, so that you had that iterative tackling of issues. Or if there was a major issue, then you negotiated a change to the next session. I have a real problem with end of module feedback because, yes, it's good in terms of looking at how I improve it next time. It does nothing for those students that have been through it. And it psychologically makes a massive difference for students to, and also it's a corrective point. I remember getting an award once for telling students I wouldn't do something for them. Magic, because they said I had the balls to actually say there was a very good reason why I wouldn't do X, Y, and Z. So it's being very clear about those boundaries. I remember arguing with a colleague once about we should be giving 24-hour support. Not if you want to externally regulate and mollycoddle and burn yourself out. That's really unhelpful to enable, we need to provide the seeds for students to be able to manage, but it needs to be very clear what those boundaries are. And it might be, I've got 3,000 students. Yeah, you're going to get this one type of feedback. It's going to not look sexy. It's going to be very blunt, and it's going to be but you're all going to get it at this point. And this is how it's going to work. So you need to make it work for the system you're in, but it's that clarity of expectation and consistency, as we know, that makes a difference. But that's all around expectation management, and we need to do more of that. I agree. Because I'm quite passionate about it as well, Claire. So great, your work sounds brilliant. Anybody else want to come in and talk about anything or raise any particular issues that they have? I've lost any ability to see the chat. Laura.
Hi, Carol. How are you?
I'm fine for seeing you.
Very good. I wanted to ask, that was great, by the way, and obviously I was involved with the project at Southampton, so it's really nice to see some of that work drawn together and put into a broader context. But I suppose it's not necessarily on the assessment side, more on the feedback side, that I wanted to ask a question and sort of get your advice in terms of sometimes you're dealing with really, really large classes, and the only way in which you can actually return feedback, I suppose, in a timely way where it would be useful is to maybe provide class feedback, because quite often the mistakes, all the sort of good things that students do tend to be in common. And you find that if you do it for an individual, you're just repeating yourself over and over again. So we've gone with a kind of class feedback approach and tried to make that as detailed as possible and useful, but we constantly get feedback from the students that the feedback in a class context isn't useful to them because it's not personal. But in reality, you'd be writing exactly the same thing if you were writing on their own individual script. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts around that and how maybe that can be embedded so it's more effective.
That's a classic one. And some of the most successful people we've had are those that in large, for example, chemistry classes where it was a massive group, but the group felt it was personal, but it actually wasn't. And coming back to that, there are some interesting things. Yeah, most of the literature will say that students don't recognise individual feedback from generic feedback. You're right, but I remember also when I was at Southampton sending the generic feedback I gave on my module to other module leads who said, it's exactly the same on ours. Can we adapt it and reuse it? I said, you can, but obviously look at it. I think there are several things. I think one, it's around there are three things I wrote down as you were talking. One is it goes back to that expectation management about we need to do things in a timely way, otherwise it's pointless. All right. So, and there are common errors. I mean, I use short answer questions or self-quizzes or the quizzes to identify if everybody gets question 7 wrong. I will tell the students, we ain't focusing on any of the other questions. We're focusing on question 7 because most of you were fine on the other questions, and there is a guide to if you've got others wrong, see this online guide. It will guide you to those, but we're going to focus on question 7. I think it's clarifying with them the value of generic feedback, so explaining that. But there's other things that you can do. So again, I remember being stuck with a very large group of students, and I was the only member of staff because of, as we know, all the things that happen. And I divided them into 20 groups. And I broke up the session, and so I gave them the generic feedback, and then I trained leads for those 20 groups. And I said, right, you're now going to meet in those groups to look at that generic feedback as a group and look at your own work. And then you're going to come back and have a discussion around it. And yes, we had to use a session to do that, which lost a teaching session, but it was so powerful. And then from that, I said, what is each one of you taking from that? And they had to post that in a Padlet style thing online or in a blog. And then they would be asking each other saying, actually, it's this that I've got the issue. Has anybody got any good resources on that? And then they went through a bartering system because we'd set that up at the first way. What can you each give to somebody else? Because you will have better skills in some areas than other people have, or you'll know a resource that's more accessible. And so, yes, it needs moderating, but if you set that up, you take it from the generic to the personal, and that's where you've got to get. But you don't need to do it all. You do need to train them and set them up to do that, which takes time. But once you've done it, it's magical. But you have to do it early and you have to put those boundaries in. So that would be a suggestion. There are others.
That's great. Thank you. I might follow up with you.
Yeah. Okay. But you can do it really. I've seen people do it really well. And I'm copying that. I copied that idea from somebody else.
Okay.
As well. So, but it bases on that fact about what can, I as you know, I am the advocate of less is more. Mm-hmm. Because I come from a cognitive processing perspective that in actual fact, quite a large percent of the time, the messages that people pick up from feedback aren't what you intended. So again, cut out the noise. What is the really fundamental thing? Because people tend to focus on the minutiae. What's the fundamental thing? But also, how can they find how to address that? Because if I had no knowledge, you telling me the fundamental thing has no value because I don't understand what you're telling me. So I need to direct you to a source which is going to show you, to give you that light bulb moment, or I need to direct you to a more knowledgeable other who can also help you, or I need to model it for you, or model it for the class because that's more efficient if it's a common thing, or provide vignettes. So the other thing I do would be, if I've got a set of students going through the system, I look at those that have either become undone or done well, and I get them to do mini blogs of 1 or 2 minutes to post those for next year's students to say, this person had the same problem of you. This is how they tackled it. So they get to see different examples, and you can collate those, and they're powerful. They are really powerful. Or the good one to do is at the end of something, to get all students to do 1 or 2 minutes. What would you have done differently, having been through it, that you can really give as a gift to the next cohort? What would it be? They're very powerful. They don't take a lot of time. They're good. So
nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, I was talking and muted. A good point that CMO Guire put in the chat was a quote: "Ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better." I love that. I think that's absolutely wonderful.
And I mean, it comes from the California, smart failing was very much a Californian thing. But the problem we have, and I don't know if other people have picked this one up, I wrote about something years ago about the increasingly mute nature of my first year undergraduates, because I kind of, for many years, I was kind of in the master's zone, and then I moved into teaching more undergraduates. So, but it was really fascinating that I found that they wouldn't speak. And that's a generalization, but the students I had were quite mute. And I had to resort to quite amazing tactics to actually get them to speak. And that fear of looking stupid, that fear of being found out is massive for many groups of students. So my question is, how do you address that early doors to get students up to speed? And where do you identify where the problems are? So, for example, in my own situation, I gave them loads of resources. I thought it was very well organized. I took them around a learning environment, but they still couldn't get it. And they said, actually, the articles are way beyond our access. We just don't understand them, so we don't get started. So I said, okay, pick an article. We'll use this one article, and I want you all to come to the session highlighting things that you don't understand. And I said, there's no excuse then. Nobody can not be able to come into that session, because it's what you don't understand, and you should know that. So it's, where do you pick up where the problem lies at that point of entry? And we also used to ask students at the beginning of sessions, what's the most important thing on your mind, and track that over time. That's fascinating. And the subject variations in that over a semester or trimester is absolutely phenomenal about what's most on their mind. And remember the Friedlander quote that we focus on what's most on our mind. So attending to knowing what's most on their minds is really important. And how do you dampen down some of those anxieties to get your focus on where you want to go?
I guess one thing that comes from that, which is a Samuel Beckett quote, apparently brilliant, is the issue, which I put in the chat, is the issue of learning through failure. And higher education doesn't really, in a lot of ways, allow for that, because we assign marks to everything. So if someone fails, they just lose the marks for it. What do you think about that, Carol?
Well, yeah, I mean, in actual way, fear of failure is, when I talked about those different pathways that self-regulation can take, we get into learned helplessness, where I really believe there is no point me trying, and self-worth motivation, I protect my ego at all costs, so I might want to act like the clown. But that there are massive issues within the school systems in different countries. Some encourage that practicing and failing, and I know lots of really good primary schools for young kids, age 4 to 11. I know some brilliant head teachers who really wanted to do that, but a lot of kickback from parents, actually, of parents not wanting their children to experience that. The other thing from the Schneider and Prekel analysis was that how people do depends on their past history of success, of experiencing success. So their argument is, in a way, is that failure is cumulative. So again, it goes back to how do you encourage that focus on process and that perspective, that kind of another deep metacognitive process, that it's part of the journey I go on, and it's not a reflection of me as a human being. But I ask you that, and I'll constantly raise this with you, and I don't know if anybody would agree with me, but as I said, I came into higher education as a second or third career, and I couldn't believe the amount of failure as an academic you have to experience. The chances of securing a big grant are really hard. The chances of being published in the journal that you want are really hard. And I think we as academics get lots of knockbacks ourselves. I think it's a tough regime. Now, you could say it's true across the planet on that, but we have a lot of students coming into higher education who've always been successful, and especially many from the private sector. They've always put the hours in, they've got the rewards. To suddenly be undone, we've also got all the issue at the moment in the UK in terms of the grades that students got awarded in schools and their expectation that nothing less than 80% or whatever, or a first, will be good enough. So that also has to be managed. So I think it's, going back to answering your question, I think it's repeated opportunities at low risk activities helps to embed that. So I had some international students who hated group activities. So I would set up sessions so they would have 3 minutes to go and explain something, get something back from somebody else. So I started it off on low stakes to promote that exchanging of getting an idea out. Or in a big undergraduate group, because of individual saving a face, you start it from a group perspective and work it down to the individual level to do those kind of things. So how do you protect the environment and the individual, but at the same time getting them to test, but also get that bigger perspective about the end game, that this is just a step. And again, on a self-regulating frame, there was one experiment we did where we actually used very blunt approaches. So one thing that was very important was giving students time to process. So often feedback is given immediately after somebody's received something because we think that that's the right thing to do. I would argue there would be an awful lot of research which says you've got to give people time. Otherwise, that first interaction, again, talking about working memory capacity and emotional load, they're not hearing you. When I used to work in schools or hospitals, a lot of the students would say to me, we didn't hear you. We just felt what a failure we were, or we thought about the implications of not passing this particular step. They don't hear you. So it's giving very short feedback at that point to reassure, but also to say that there is some work to be done or whatever, but also then planning in a time for that feedback when somebody has had time to go through it, to rationalize it, to be in a position to take it. And then I ran one small project where we gave students an example. They could come and they could offload, and we could do the tutorial could be a self-help session, or they could come saying it's not the end of the world, and the whole session would be based on a strategy of how they were going to turn things around. They chose what approach they wanted when they walked in the door. Only one chose to have the more mentoring counselling session. All of the others parked the emotions at the door, came in. Okay, how do we blitz this then? So it's training in emotional regulation, but actually saying it's not the end. It's how do we move this forward? What are the steps that you need to take? I'm not doing it for you, but this is how you do it. So I think there's there's quite a work there in terms of personal tutoring and how academic tutoring, personal tutoring comes together productively to move students forwards. Then there's a lot of work done by Catherine Eccleston years ago about mollycoddling, and that's what we shouldn't be doing either at all.
Any thoughts on that, Kate? That sort of answer your ideas. Sorry, Kate, do I? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, I've got one saying low state. Yeah, low state. And also another one is I talk about peer engagement, peer activities that support students to understand, as opposed to peer assessment. When we did some work with people of 50, 60, 70 even, who have been through masters, through different pathways, they still remembered their undergraduate days where their whole degree classification was changed by some large element of peer assessment. I don't believe that should happen in my book. It should be, if it wants to be a component, but it shouldn't be the changing of a grade level. I think that's very damaging. So again, it's about that autonomy. I want students to be able to be responsible to say what feedback's been useful from peers and what they reject, and how they have supported others. I don't want them to be constrained by others in a situation like that. So there are some really interesting things about really good peer assessment activities and ones which actually I think can be quite undermining.
Oops.
Well, the point that Kay's made is all around mindsets, isn't it? It's about whether it's and its perceptions about what quality learning is, and that comes into that deep approach. Am I learning to have a better understanding of something, or is my end goal? The thing is called performance goals. Am I only interested in being the best? If I'm Ronaldo, he has said, hasn't he? He is only interested in being the best. All right. Or do I have mastery goals where I want to master something? But you can't separate the two, because performance goals lead to success, as do mastery goals. However, somebody who is totally performance goal led, the damage to their ego is greater. If they have to be the best, how often are they going to be the best? So there is that thing about, it's also in mastering it for themselves, not necessarily always competing to be better than everybody else, because that psychologically can be very limiting. Yeah, and Thomas put group work. I talk a lot in this framework about authenticity. And again, in group work, and again, it depends how you set it up, and this comes into lots of different notions. I will upset some of the populace and others, but I don't necessarily want every individual in a group to do the same. I want them to operate as in a real world environment, whereby I want them to be able to identify the best skill sets of each individual and to deploy those skills to maximum effect to get the end product that they as a group want to get. Which means them being able to utilize the skills of each individual to the best of their ability, which doesn't mean them all doing the same thing. And I often think that group assessment measures sometimes the wrong things. And I also would like group assessment to measure the process of how that group got to where they got, and what they also think that they missed and what they would move forward on next time. But again, you've got to train students in that the more you know, the less you know is a skill set that's valuable, not one they're going to be marked down against. So that also is part of that notion of knowing knowing it. The more you know, the less you know concept. But some people find that very hard. And so that needs to be inculcated throughout, that not knowing is a skill. It's a very big skill.
Yeah, very big skill.
So, I love that stage of unconscious incompetence. I think it's a lovely state to be in, but not forever. And it's that state of, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff about self-regulation, which is quite counter to worries about student satisfaction, in terms of you need to let students experience difficulty in order to, those who have parents will know this, in terms to be able to start to work out solutions before you step in and solve it all for them. We shouldn't be doing that. But that's a hard one to balance along thing. Again, one project that worked very well was actually looking at the learning journeys of the students across the semester, and then identifying where the blockages were going to be, and then getting students from higher year groups to put in training at those various points just in time, a bit like Toyota, putting in support just in time before those crunch points, because we knew where we had a general pattern, and we knew those crunch points were always at that point. Really effective way of actually supporting students, and they loved it. And then they would volunteer the next year to do it for the following year group. So some of these things take quite a long time to embed, but we have to start somewhere. And when people start to see gains, real gains, it really does motivate people to get more involved.
Cool. It's coming up to 2 o'clock, so I think we ought to call it a day there. Thank you, Carol, for a really interesting and engaging webinar. And thank you, everyone, for all your questions and comments, and for coming along at such a busy time. I popped it in earlier, but I'll pop it in now. We've got a little, oh, God, yeah. Yeah, in the evening in Australia. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a bedtime drink, so you can, yes.
So, yeah, I'll just pop a little link in there. Just a little bit of feedback on the webinar itself, just 5 simple questions, but also there's an opportunity if you'd like more information, if you'd like to keep current with our projects, and if you'd like us to help you embed the EAT framework or work as a pilot case study for us, then there's an opportunity on there for you to be part of that. So again, thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate you taking your time. And Carol, a last word from you.
No, sorry to interrupt you, Steve. No, one was, as I said, we're trying now to develop the psychometric tool for staff and students to be a very strong predictive tool that can be used early doors, but we need a big enough sample to make sure it works across institutions. If you would be interested, we'd love to work with you. So do also let us know about that. And you can find Steve and I very easily through email and also through the SurveyMonkey. But I also wanted to say thank you for your time, especially those that got up early. That my evil part of the day for me, and those of you who are staying up late, go off, dance, do what you need to do. But thank you, everybody, because it is a really challenging time yet again. And thank you for giving up your time to come today and for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you. And there will be more webinars from the project, and also from another group that Carol and I are involved with assessment. So I'll send you a link about the next one of those as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Look after yourselves.